Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche organization with your daily video update for November 12th, 2025. There's a lot going on, and I'm going to be focusing primarily on the war danger that continues to emanate from the financial and economic circles in the West, particularly centered around British intelligence and the deep state in the United States. But what we're looking at is the fact that Europe's leaders are facing their emperor's new clothes moment. That is, they're planning things which they can't possibly deliver. And if they try, they're going to be exposed with nothing to back it up. And that's why I call it the emperor's new clothes moment. Now, let's start in the Western theater, the Caribbean, where it appears as though the U.S. is preparing for a military assault on Venezuela. The USS Gerald Ford carrier group left Africa and is now headed for the Caribbean. Interestingly, this includes a couple of destroyers, one named the USS Mahon, after Admiral Mahon, who was a great admirer of British sea power in the end of the 19th century. And secondly, the USS Winston Churchill. You know who he is. It's interesting that the U.S. is preparing for a possible imperial war with the name of ships after leading promoters of British imperial policy. Now, there's been an escalation of rhetoric against Venezuela, the Maduro regime, and there are two reasons given now for why the U.S. might attack. The first one is oil politics. The London's Daily Telegraph had an article saying that if you remove the limitations on Venezuela's oil exports, it will drive down prices, and this would have a significant impact on Russia and Saudi Arabia. In other words, use the oil weapon against Russia and the Saudis. Secondly, the U.S. is deploying in this area to stop China in South America. This is a theme that Marco Rubio has talked about. The U.S. Southern Command, which is responsible for this area, has also been warning of Chinese incursions into South America. And they think that this is that attacking Venezuela is a way of stopping the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, we have published a warning issued by the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity saying don't get involved in a war in the hemisphere, and pointing out that the U.S. had certain illusions before it went into Iraq, before it went into Afghanistan, and all of those illusions led to catastrophes. So I would encourage you to watch the interview that was done on the new EIR platform with Graham Fuller, a former top CIA official, where he goes through the reasons why this would be a catastrophe. So that's going to be linked at the bottom of the description page. Now, while we're watching this potential dangerous situation in this hemisphere, don't take your eyes off Ukraine. There's a series of developments which bring about both speculation about how to win the war, but also a lot of misinformation about how the war is going. Let's take a look at what the British are saying about it. Because naturally, when you talk about Ukraine, from the British standpoint, there's the question of how do we destroy Russia. And there's an article from the Royal United Services Institute, which is one of the leading British military think tanks, by someone named Jack Waitling. And he makes the following points, one of which is totally coherent with the U.S. policy towards Venezuela. He said that if you close the Strait of Denmark to Russian ships, that 80% of Russian oil exports pass through there. And if you close the sea lanes in the Baltic, this would severely weaken Russia because of the inability to export oil. Now, interestingly, British forces in Estonia are doing military exercises to simulate taking over and boarding ships in the Baltic. They capture them and shut them down. Now, how is this going to be enforced? Sea battles? This is where you see the illusions. You think the Russians are going to just send ships into an area that's it's now being called a NATO lake, the Baltic. And there are reports of submarine traffic escalating in the area. So do you really think the Russians are going to allow their ships to be shut down and boarded and oil confiscated? Now, secondly, Wakeling writes that the Ukraine situation is not a manpower problem, that Ukraine has enough people that could serve in the armed forces. There are many reports that Ukraine, the army is overstretched, the recruitment is collapsing, and what Wakeling says is, no, it's not a manpower problem, it's a need to upgrade training. And he calls for in-country military training. By whom? By NATO? The Ukrainians have much more experience in fighting now than the NATO forces. What would they get from NATO? Secondly, do you really want NATO to be openly seen now as participating in a war against Russia? And third, when he says there's no manpower problem, what about the fact that there have been 160,000 desertions from the Ukrainian army this year alone? Now, the third point that Wakeling makes is Poland and Romania should deploy their air force to protect Ukraine from Russian military air traffic. In other words, a air force deployment over Ukrainian airspace. Again, this risks becoming a party to the war. Of course, they're already party to the war, but there's a certain point at which the Russians will no longer tolerate this. Now, of course, the other proposal addresses the weakness of the European economy and the inability to afford this. And that proposal is to use the seized Russian assets, allegedly over $300 billion worth, to finance the war, the purchase of weapons, training, and so on. That's an absolute violation of international law. If they do that, it will send a clear signal to every other country that you cannot trust the West at all when it comes to monetary policy. Now, what's the reality in Ukraine? There's a continuing Russian drive to, in the Donbass in particular, to weaken and destroy the Ukrainian army. This is the Pokrovsk cauldron is one area, but it's a fairly intensive drive overall. Now, at the same time, you have arrests underway of some of Zelensky's leading allies in the government on charges of what? Corruption. Continually, this is the issue that's hurting Ukraine. One of the people who is going to be arrested is a guy named Mandich, who's called Zelensky's wallet man, and there are reports that he's fled the country. So this raises the whole question of who are you going to be able to work with in Ukraine, and can you continue to pour money in there without fears that it will be stolen? Now then we come to the question of Germany. This is the weak man in the European side. Now that's saying a lot. In the U3, which includes Great Britain, France, and Germany, each of those countries is facing severe economic crises. Macron has been struggling to get a government in that will carry out the austerity that he says is necessary. Starmer has no credibility and no support whatsoever. And Merz, who is the chancellor from BlackRock, has also stumbled terribly since he took office a few months ago. Now, there's a big debate in the German Bundestag over military conscription. It's not just Ukraine that has a problem of manpower shortage. There's the Bundeswehr, the German army, is woefully understaffed. Now, the problem they have is, where are they going to get the soldiers? And there's a huge fight over mandatory conscription, which the government has, for the moment, backed off from the fight because they're up against not only the Alternative for Deutschland, which says no mandatory recruitment as long as there's a war going on, but also leaders in the Christian Democratic Union, the Merz's party, are opposed to mandatory conscription. Now, at the same time, you have the economic collapse in Germany. The auto sector is reeling. Car sales are down 24% compared to last year. Heavy machinery, tractors, vehicles of that sort are down 34%. Layoffs, factory closings. Why is that? Is it Putin? No, it's the high cost of electricity and the foolishness of the Green Revolution, which convinced the auto companies to move to electric cars when the German people don't want that. And so you have a collapse going on in the driving industrial sector of Europe. At the same time, you have an infrastructure collapse. Now, how are you going to maintain a government that's going into war when you have these kinds of problems? And that's what Merz is facing. That's what Germany is facing. That's what France and Britain, Belgium, Italy, all the countries of Europe that are pushing for war with Russia have to acknowledge that they don't have the support of their own population. So how are they going to win a war? And this is where we see the problem of trying to fight a war without a military. Now, I would encourage people to tune in this afternoon in Europe and this morning in the United States when I'll be discussing these issues with Helga Zepp-LaRouche in our weekly webcast. She just finished a conference in Paris. I hope some of you have watched some of the footage from that, of building a youth movement to transform Europe from this group of frightened parasites who are trying to steal essentially the future, and instead how we're building a movement of youth to invigorate these countries which otherwise are heading down the tubes. So tune in. It's at 11 a.m. Eastern Time on the SchillerInstitute.com website. Thanks, and I'll see you then.